This is David Barsamian, and my guest is Bill Schaap, editor of the Covert Action and Information Bulletin and director of the Institute for Media Analysis in New York. Bill, in the summer 1987 issue of Covert Action on the CIA and drugs, you write in an editorial, "The CIA has been, from its inception, a major source of opium, heroin, and now crack," unquote. And more recently, on February 10th, 1988, at Columbia University, you said the CIA is probably the biggest drug dealer in the world. Those are pretty sensational charges, and I was wondering if you could give us some documentary evidence.
Well, there's been a great deal published and exposed about the early CIA operations. Unfortunately, as is typical with this kind of investigation, the most current material is usually much harder to find, but historically I can give you a very quick rundown. Among the very early CIA operations shortly after it was created in the late 40s was a major operation, for example, to suppress a dock workers' strike in Marseille, which was led by communist-dominated trade unions, and the CIA was very worried that they would gain an influence if the strike was successful. They made a deal with the Corsican Mafia, the very powerful drug lords of that time, who were responsible for most of the opium and heroin coming into Europe. They made a deal with them to provide a bunch of thugs, strikebreakers, who went to Marseille and broke heads and bones and so on, and crushed the strike. The quid pro quo for that help was for the U.S. to turn its eyes the other way and to urge its allies to turn their eyes with respect to their drug traffic. And this, as far as we know, continued for a number of years. Another major CIA involvement in drugs has been very broadly exposed, and that was their involvement with the heroin traffic out of Southeast Asia. During the 60s into the early 70s, there was massive heroin traffic out of Southeast Asia being run by organizations which were working very closely with the CIA, and in some instances the U.S. Army as well, in the Vietnam War. Primarily the Hmong tribesmen who worked under a General Vang Pao, a Laotian general who now lives out in Montana on a ranch. He had a major drug factory which was protected by the CIA because he was letting his men work as a secret army for the CIA. And there was similar operations going on with many other people in the Golden Triangle area. Primarily in Laos, but also some people involved in Thailand and Burma and so on. It's a pretty rough country there, and when you get out into the far reaches, there are no really viable governments. There were warlords. There are areas of northern Burma to this day that are being run by refugees from the Kuomintang forces, and they're responsible for a very large portion of all the heroin in the world, and they were getting a lot of help from the CIA. Also, at least what a lot of our research leads us to believe, is that the CIA itself has been more directly involved in drug traffic, not simply turning its eyes away, when it's been necessary either to raise funds for clandestine operations for which other funds were not available, or to get particular individuals to do particular operations. It's happening now, we would say, with respect to the war in Central America. One of the interesting things that's come to light is that the planes supplying the Contras in Costa Rica and in Honduras, but particularly Costa Rica, are being allowed to land on private airstrips owned by gangsters involved in the cocaine traffic, and here again, the quid pro quo for letting the Contra supply planes land is being unmolested in their cocaine traffic. And indeed, as has been shown in several documentaries on television and a lot of articles that have appeared, they're even using the same planes. In some instances, the planes which fly supplies down to the Contras fly drugs back to the United States. And this is going on a regular basis.
Leslie Coburn, in her book Out of Control, talks about this, and in a couple of documentaries she did for CBS West 57th Street. Let me pose this question to you. You have this network of, as is suggested, guns south, drugs north, with pilots landing at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, for example, and saying that they got paid $75,000 for the run. The people that are giving this testimony are, in most cases, convicted criminals. They're drug runners. They're professional liars. How can they be credible sources?
Well, that's an objection that's very often raised, and it's something that prosecutors have to deal with all the time. By and large, the only people who are going to have any eyewitness testimony to a criminal operation are going to be criminals. They don't call in the neighborhood bishop off the street to come in and listen into the meetings, so that all of the witnesses will have pretty shabby pasts, but that doesn't make them any more or less credible than anyone else. The fact is that the evidence keeps piling up. It's possible that any person could be lying about a particular story. There's a logical difficulty, though, because it didn't help these people. They were not getting any benefits by telling about this U.S. involvement. In fact, if anything, they were getting more heat on them. But it's not an uncommon thing in the past. One of the things we've learned is the CIA doesn't usually change its tricks very much. It just modifies them to the current situation, and they've done this before. There's a whole book been written about all the different ways of going in and out with heroin throughout the period of the Vietnam War, called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. And that describes many methods which are being used now in Central America. It's true that one or another of the witnesses have criminal records, and it's certainly true that any pilot who testifies to this is someone who has himself been flying in drugs. But you're not going to there's nobody else on the plane who's going to tell you about the plane.
In an earlier answer, you hinted about something I'm going to ask you about right now, and that is, it just doesn't seem to make sense for the agency to risk its power, its prestige, its status with such an onerous thing as drug trafficking. Why would they do it?
Well, they do it for the money. I mean, they do it because it involves huge amounts of money, and that enables them to get a lot of leverage with people they want to use. They do the same thing with arms. There's a great deal of arms trading and trafficking that goes on in these similar kind of operations, where they need to build up money in order to pay other people to fight their wars. I think that they're not too worried about the opprobrium they might get if it came out, because there are so many layers of deniability, there's so much fuzziness, it's so difficult to prove who is working for whom. Most of these operations are not done with official U.S. government employees involved. When the plane crashes and you get a Hassenfuss or somebody like that, you're not going to get a second secretary at the U.S. Embassy on that plane. Nobody like that's going to be on it. No high-ranking CIA official or case officer will be on the plane or will be actually handling the drugs. They will be the people coordinating it, paying the people, telling everybody who should do what. And they try to protect themselves that way. They also have many layers by which they insulate the funds involved, proprietary banks and trading corporations and so on. And it's only when somebody talks, for whatever reason, that we find out about these things. We don't find out about them in a vacuum. Someone has to decide to say something or show somebody where some documents are, or in rare cases like the plane crash, documents will be found that no one ever intended would be found by other people.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the structure of the agency works? How do the orders originate, or how are activities initiated?
Well, one of the things that I think is a myth that a lot of people are led to believe, or the CIA would like people to believe, is that when these strange activities are uncovered, very often the CIA and the administration of the day will announce that something got out of control, somebody was doing something on their own. We call it the rogue elephant theory, or the loose cannon theory. In fact, that's almost never the case. If you read all the books that have been written by former CIA people, left, right, and center, they basically say that almost everything that's done is what the administration wants done. They're following orders, they're executing policy from on high, and occasionally, as apparently is the case with our current president, there may be some things where the president is not aware of much of the substance. There are many times things where presidents aren't aware of the details, but the general thrust of it is clear. No matter what Reagan did or didn't know, for example, about Iran-Gate, Contra-Gate stuff, he had made it very clear to the people below him that he wanted them to do whatever was necessary to get funds to the Contras. And if what was necessary involved arms deals around the world to raise the funds from the profits to funnel off to them, they were still doing what he wanted. It was not a shock that the funds raised were being funneled to the Contras. And that's been the case historically for the 40 years the CIA has been operating, that they're generally following orders, sometimes very specifically, sometimes somewhat generally. And there can be a lot of discretion on the part of area chiefs or chiefs of station or so on, but they basically know what it is that the policy objective is. And unfortunately, tend to think they're virtually outside the law in terms of accomplishing it.
What might be some legitimate activities that the CIA could engage in? For example, isn't the United States, an administration entitled to have legitimate intelligence about foreign activities?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, unfortunately, that's another one of those myths that the CIA is essentially an intelligence gathering agency. If it were, we wouldn't have the objections that we do. Every nation wants to gather intelligence, and every nation has since time immemorial, and for very important reasons that leaders of countries have to make very significant decisions, and they want to know what the facts are. They want to know what's going on. But the fact is that the CIA doesn't spend most of its time gathering and analyzing intelligence these days. It spends maybe a third of its time doing paramilitary covert operations, interfering essentially violently in the affairs of other countries. It spends maybe a third of its time doing propaganda and operations, media disinformation campaigns, and so on, and less than a third of its time gathering and analyzing intelligence. In fact, in the U.S., I would say that far more intelligence gathering is done by the National Security Agency with microwave interception. I mean, they can listen to every word that's broadcast by any radio or television station in the world. You gather vast amounts of intelligence that way. There are analysts in Langley and at the NSA and at the State Department and everywhere else who read all the magazines and newspapers and whatnot that are published, and you find a lot of intelligence that way. But the CIA is primarily a covert action arm of the executive, and it's primarily engaged in interfering in the affairs of other countries, not learning what's going on in the other countries, but interfering in the other countries.
Does it have a domestic component as well?
Oh, absolutely. I don't. It's not compartmentalized that way, I don't think, except that there is a liaison with the FBI and with the Justice Department. But another, sadly, myth that people believe is that the CIA is not allowed by law to operate in the United States, and there is no such law. There is a law which says it's not allowed to exercise internal police functions, although that's not defined and nobody knows quite what it means. It's just that the Congress in 1947 didn't want a Gestapo. But there's no prohibition against operations in the United States if they relate to the sphere of interest of the CIA, foreign affairs. And in fact, the Reagan administration has been quite blatant about it. The Carter administration purported to prohibit covert operations, dirty tricks in the United States, even if they related to foreign affairs. And the Reagan administration changed the regulation so that they can conduct, pursuant to regulation, dirty tricks in the United States if they're in furtherance of administration foreign policy objectives, which is a frightening thought in itself.
What are some examples of CIA propaganda and media operations in the United States and abroad?
Well, the ones abroad are easier to, because so many have been exposed. A very well-known one that John Stockwell exposed was the newspaper campaign about the atrocities being committed by Cuban troops in Angola. There was a long series of newspaper reports suggesting that Cuban troops were raping Angolan women, rampaging through the countryside to the point where they had to be arrested and tried and executed by Angolans. And in fact, none of this was true. It was being made up at a typewriter in Zaire, where some of Stockwell's friends, who were experts in propaganda, were sitting down and writing what would purport to be a news story, then feeding it to an agent who would be a stringer for some local wire service, who would then send it off to Reuters, who would then send it off to New York, and it would then appear all over the country as well as all over the world as a news story emanating from Angola. And in fact, it was written by people who hadn't set foot in Angola. And this kind of direct insertion of news is very common. Again, even though they were planting the story in Africa in a way that it would get sent to London, they were still affecting the public opinion in the United States, because the important thing was the story being picked up here. It wasn't important that the story would run in an African newspaper or even a British newspaper. They did these kind of operations so the stories would run in the United States. And this is fairly common. They run through disinformation themes all the time. One of the problems, of course, is that it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between a CIA media agent and an ordinary right-wing correspondent who happens to agree with them. There is a very willing network of right-wing journalists who will run with almost any lead they get, whether it's from the CIA or administration press releases or whatnot. So the fact that dozens of people will write about Yellow Rain or the Libyan hit squad or the Bulgarian connection and so on doesn't make them all CIA agents. Some of them certainly are. It's been estimated that the CIA has thousands of journalists on its payroll all around the world, probably more foreign correspondents than AP and UPI and TASS and Reuters put together. And they spend billions of dollars on it.
What about efforts to discredit the freeze and peace movement? For example, Claire Sterling articles in the Reader's Digest, editorials in the Washington Post suggesting that the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was a Soviet front organization and things like that.
That's actually one of the major disinformation campaigns of the Reagan administration, the attempt to show that the peace movement in general and the nuclear freeze movement in particular was a KGB plot of some kind, and that if you supported peace, nuclear disarmament, the freeze movement, any of those, you were then at best a KGB dupe and at worst an agent yourself. It was astonishing the lengths to which the Reagan administration went, and the president himself. You may recall there was a time when he suggested that proof of the Soviet conspiracy could be found in the fact that people at U.S. peace marches were carrying signs that had similar slogans to those being carried in peace marches in Moscow. I mean, it was astonishing. I mean, if someone had a sign said, ban nuclear weapons here, and someone in Moscow had such a sign, the president said, see, that proves that they're really a part of this conspiracy. And that was a major thrust of the early years of the Reagan administration. It was muted a little bit once various disarmament talks started and once there were summits with Gorbachev and so on. But in the early years, this was a major campaign by the administration. All of its media assets, witting and unwitting and friendly and whatnot, were used in it, and there was just an incredible deluge of articles about this in not just in extreme right-wing publications, but centrist publications as well.
What about CIA efforts to link, for example, Fidel Castro or the Sandinistas with drug trafficking? Has that been part of their operation?
That's been a major one. That's another interesting case. We were talking earlier about what do you do when your only witnesses are criminals. The U.S. government brought a series of indictments in Florida, the last being the Noriega one, in which, based certainly in the early indictments, based only on the testimony of one apparent drug smuggler who was facing many years in jail, they got a statement suggesting that various Cuban and Nicaraguan officials were involved in drug trafficking. Later on, the president accused the Sandinista leadership of being involved in drug trafficking and had that famous fuzzy picture of two people holding a box walking toward an airplane, which he said was one of them was Tomas Borge or some other comandante, and of course they were totally unrecognizable. Nobody knew who anybody was in the picture, but more to the point, they were carrying a box which the president said was filled with cocaine. Nobody else said it, and of course nobody had the box. The interesting thing about the Cuban indictment of the Miami indictment of the Cuban officials and others also had no evidence, no Exhibit A. They said that they arrested a man coming in on a boat who said he was coming in for the Cubans, but that he threw all the drugs overboard when he saw he was going to be captured, and he then told them, they say, what the drugs were, and therefore that became the evidence for the drug possession charges. It's almost, no respectable prosecutor would go with such a case. They weren't worried, of course, because the Cuban officials weren't about to come surrender themselves to Miami officials for such a trial. But it was a ludicrous case with absolutely no tangible evidence, no physical evidence at all, and the testimony of one drug smuggler.
Were you satisfied with the Iran-Contra investigation?
No, not at all. I think that there was an effort on the part of the staff people and on the part of most of the members of Congress involved to limit how far they went. I think there was a real damage control operation in a way. It's true that a certain amount of interesting information did come out, and that's helpful. But I think that, for example, there was a very strong effort not to let the drug connection come up. Every time that almost reared its ugly head, someone would squelch it. Someone would say that was classified information, we couldn't deal with it, and nothing about Contra drug trafficking came out of those hearings. Also, I think that there was an attempt to focus on what they considered the private end of it, the privatizing of the war, the Secord's private company and Singlaub's work and so on, without really trying to get into the question of whether Secord and Singlaub and the rest weren't, in fact, not private at all, but were doing what they were doing for the government. And also without looking into other operations and other people. The weapons dealing that was touched upon was the tip of the iceberg, as far as we can tell. There have certainly been a lot of reports of vastly more gigantic and complicated weapons deals taking place, which weren't touched upon by the committee. I mean, one of the problems is that there were former CIA officials who were on the staff of the committee, who were certainly not there to make sure that the CIA got zapped. And the other, perhaps fortuitous thing that happened for them was Casey's illness and death, so that a great deal was blamed on Casey, and a great deal of people were able to say, a great number of people were able to say, well, Casey knew that, and he didn't tell the president, or he didn't tell someone else, or he didn't do something about it. So they had a very convenient scapegoat in that sense. I think that there were a number of other levels on which I thought the hearings were very bad. I thought there was a great deal of fawning over people like Oliver North and Secord and so on, and every member of the committee was tripping over his own feet in order to say what great patriots I thought they were. They had the nerve to bring on one of the Cuban exiles who had been responsible for blowing up the Cubana airliner and killing 70 or 80 innocent people and treat him like he was a hero. They had a lot of really shabby characters on who were involved in vast amounts of lawbreaking, and were treating them like patriots, and at worst misguided patriots. And I think they were, a far greater bunch of sleazeballs than the committee would ever deal with them. The only person who ever said anything touching on what I thought was a central issue was the one time when Senator Inouye started to mention the Nuremberg principles. And the Nuremberg principles are something that should always be mentioned when you're talking about the Contras, because we're supporting a force that's violating them. But North's lawyer jumped and screamed, and the point was ended.
Did you learn anything from Bob Woodward? Did you learn anything from Bob Woodward's book Veil?
A little bit. It's has some interesting insights. The problem is that I think, I wouldn't call it damage control, but I think that the book has its problems in being too, on the one hand, personalizing things too much with Casey, as if Casey was doing everything. And also, I think it imputes too much good faith on the part of all the other people around him. He tries to, I think he's far too kind to the CIA in the book, and I think the motivations of a lot of people were much worse than what he says. I'm told from reviews I've read by other people that there are some errors in it, there are mistakes in it, there are things that Woodward just has wrong. And of course it's a bit of a self-serving puff piece in a way also. I mean, it's almost like a book about Bob Woodward rather than a book about Iran-Gate, which is a bit of a problem. And of course he made quite a fortune on it and had all sorts of television and radio and newspaper coverage of himself as the person doing that story. And it was a real hype job. I don't think it's that critical a book. It's probably of some value to people who really don't know much about the subject because they can learn a bit. The trouble is they also won't have any idea where he's most accurate and where he's least accurate.
In the summer 1987 Covert Action and Information Bulletin editorial, you write that the CIA involvement in chemical biological warfare, CBW, research and development, a number of researchers have raised the possibility that the AIDS epidemic is the result either intended or accidental of chemical biological warfare work. And you add, the evidence is very strong that nature alone is not responsible for AIDS. That's pretty explosive stuff.
Well, it is. It's a pretty serious world problem, the AIDS epidemic, and we were looking into the possibility of some CBW connections because there were many people raising this, many people suspecting it. Of course, many of those people were not trained doctors or scientists and simply had because they know there's been this kind of work in the past, because things can get loose. There was a lot of speculation, and we investigated and published several articles dealing with the history of chemical and biological warfare research, with the possibility that the AIDS syndrome might be caused by something that was a result of that kind of research. It's very complicated because the medical testimony is contradictory. There are scientists who say that the virus, the HIV virus, which is referred to as the cause of AIDS, there are scientists which say it's not the cause of AIDS, that some other toxic combination is the cause of AIDS. There are others who say that yes, HIV is the cause of AIDS, but it's not a natural virus, it's a genetically engineered virus. And there are others who say no, it's not a genetically engineered virus. Obviously, if it is a genetically engineered substance, then the CBW connection is obvious. Then that means that something which has something to do with AIDS was made in a laboratory. Whether it was deliberate or accidental is another thing that's very hard to tell. There are people who think that AIDS might well be deliberate. There are other people who think that that's too fantastic even for the CIA, that they would have deliberately loosed something like that. And we decided to run a survey of all these different theories because of the seriousness of the problem and because of the extent to which these questions are being raised. And the fact is that there was no definitive conclusion. There is a strong likelihood that the AIDS epidemic has some connection to man-made activity of one kind or another. It may be a byproduct of other things. It may be environmental in the sense there are many people who think that defoliants and chemicals like dioxin and so on might be connected with the initiation or the spread of AIDS. There are other people who feel that way about the chemicals that are used in connection with food and so on.
You've been a practicing attorney for more than 20 years. In your view, then, the evidence is still at this point speculative. It's not conclusive.
With respect to a CBW connection, yeah, it's still not conclusive. It's very hard to say. It's certainly clear that it has some connections beyond a traditional virus. It's fairly clear that there are cofactors involved. And when there are cofactors involved, then it's not a simple virus. It's not the simple thing that one person catches from another person regardless of other factors. It may have to do with all the chemicals we use and all the poisons that are in the air and the water and the food. It may have to do with laboratory work. We just can't tell. The point we wanted to make in really analyzing it thoroughly was that this is not a far-fetched, crazy idea. The CIA has been involved in very, very bizarre chemical biological warfare research for many, many years, and the Army has numerous secret installations dealing with that. They always refer to them as defensive research because they're saying we have to study CBW because maybe the Russians will use it against us. The problem, of course, is that offensive and defensive research in the CBW field are identical. It's exactly the same research, and they can call it defensive when in fact they're doing exactly the same thing they would be doing if they called it offensive. There have been cases before of things getting loose. There have been accidents with nerve gas research. All the sheep and the cows that died in Utah that time when something got loose. These things do happen. They make science fiction movies about them so that people tend to think that it doesn't happen in real life, but it does. And it's such a serious problem that it really has to be looked at. We felt that what we published was a fairly sober reflection of the possibilities without jumping to conclusions, but pointing out all the aberrations in the data to make people think.
What about CIA activities on U.S. college campuses and universities?
Well, that continues to be a major operation on their part. Recruiting is the lifeblood of any intelligence agency. The CIA has always been a major college recruiter. They don't generally take on people later in life. They like to take people right after they're out of college or maybe out of graduate school, and expect them to adopt the CIA as a lifetime career. And they consequently recruit on every major campus in the country, except the handful where the student protests have been so strong that they're not allowed to, and the very, very few where the administrations of those colleges have gone along with it and also forbidden open recruiting. Of course, they do secret recruiting even where they're not allowed to openly recruit. But that's how they survive. That's how they get new people, is getting people right out of college, particularly because they need, if they're going to build up cover stories for undercover operatives, you have to start from the beginning. You can't have someone have half a career that's a legitimate career and then all of a sudden switch them into some undercover career which will be totally inconsistent with the first part of their adult life.
What about placing agents in departments?
One of the most important things the CIA does in connection with recruiting is trying to build up a large number of what they call spotters, generally professors, academics teaching on campuses, with whom they establish a friendly enough relationship so that the professor will tell them who of his or her students might be likely candidates to recruit. people who won't think to apply for the CIA or to show up at the recruiting if it's a campus where they have that kind of recruiting, but who the professor thinks might be worthwhile material for them. And then they will arrange various elaborate ways to slowly and very gingerly approach those students. That's a very important thing they do, is that, and I think a very corrupt practice on the part of the academics who go along with it. Using a professor to tell the CIA who they should recruit is pretty low down. And in most cases, the professors would never dream of letting higher-ups in the university know they were doing such a thing.
There's an example at the University of California at Santa Barbara in the fall of 1987, the spring of 1988, as we speak now, of an actual agent who has been appointed to the faculty staff.
But that's openly admitted at this point. That's somewhat different from, there have been many times when CIA people have been told undercover to get academic posts, but not to say that they're CIA, not to let people know that, to pretend that they're retired State Department personnel, depending on what their cover may have been. I think it's a pretty shaky idea to begin with. I think most people, well, of course, it's my personal view, and I'm the view of a lot of people who agree with me, that the CIA is a pretty immoral organization, and people who stay with it for any length of time have been involved in very immoral work for a long time, and wouldn't, in my opinion, make the best professors. Not everyone agrees with that, and certainly in schools of international relations, diplomacy, and so on, people will want to hear from CIA folks because that's part of the real world. They want to know what they have to say. I don't think if I were connected with some university, I would not want it to be hiring people from the CIA.
What are your views on the Daniel Sheehan Christic Institute case? And I ask that question and preface it by saying that John Stockwell and Ralph McGehee, two former CIA agents, Jonathan Quitme, who writes for the Wall Street Journal and is the author of Crime of the Patriots, and many others, have been very critical and have approached the Sheehan case with great caution. What are your views on it?
Well, I share that caution to a large extent. I think that the thrust of the case is good and correct. I think the line that it's showing is, generally speaking, correct. I think the problem is that it overreaches a bit. I think it tries to prove too much, and it tries to connect too many things. It's always a problem dealing with intelligence operations, and particularly the CIA, because the truth generally turns out to be at least as strange as we might have imagined it to be, and usually even stranger. And you can't reject something by saying, no, that's too far-fetched. The CIA would never do such a thing, because in fact they will do the most far-fetched things. But I think in the particulars of this case overstate things. I think there are some conclusions that are drawn without enough evidence to fill in the gaps. I don't know if that's going to hurt or help in terms of the prosecution of the case as a case, because we have to remember that on the one hand, it's a vehicle for getting across a theory about a long history of intelligence operations, but on the other hand, it's also a damage suit by injured individuals against a group of people who they say were responsible for injuring them, directly or indirectly. So that on that level, all of this may not be a significant problem. The trouble, I think, is that if students of the intelligence operations take everything in this case as gospel, I think they'll be wrong in a number of particulars, just because it's too much and it's too complicated.
You've been reluctant to write about this in Covert Action.
Well, there's a problem. As I said, I think their motivations are good. I think the people involved are coming from the right place. I think we're all opposed in principle, as moral principle, to the work of the CIA. We're against the CIA doing what it does. And I don't want to really have squabbles with my friends when I've got enough to do with my enemies. And I think most of us progressive workers in this field feel the same way. It's not really necessary to spend that much time trying to punch holes in it. I'm hoping that as they do more investigation, they'll fill in more of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and everything they do come up with and all the documentary evidence they do obtain is going to help all the rest of us. It's practically a life's work for a lot of people that are spending all their time on that case, and the rest of us are dealing with other things. But there's enough to do working against the forces of the Reagan administration and the forces of the CIA than to worry about what in many ways are minor differences among those of us on the other side.
Another story making the rounds of the alternative press and media is the so-called October surprise, originally divulged by Barbara Honegger-Britton, who was a Reagan campaign staffer. There was an article in These Times. Christopher Hitchens wrote a couple of articles about it in The Nation, and Flora Lewis picked up on it in the New York Times. Do you have any information on it?
Well, I find it believable and consistent with other investigations that we've done because it fits with what we've uncovered in a related area, and that had to do with Delta Force and the attempted rescue of the hostages in April of '80, several months previously. We came to the conclusion that there was a very good chance that operation was doomed to failure before it was even planned, that the people who planned it knew it was doomed to failure, and that they may have commenced an operation they knew was going to fail precisely because it would embarrass President Carter and hurt him in the election. And if there were forces capable of doing that, they certainly could have had the power to at least try to arrange some situation where hostages would not be released before the election. And I was not involved in investigating the October surprise, so I don't know the depth to which that was looked into. What I'm really saying is that it's plausible because I think the hostage attempt was botched on purpose. Maybe not. When I say botched on purpose, I mean it was set up by people who knew it wasn't going to succeed. I don't think the people out there in the desert flying the helicopters, and it's certainly not the people who got killed, I don't think they knew it wasn't going to succeed, but I think they were sent on something that was pretty close to a suicide mission.
Where do you see yourself and covert action in the kaleidoscope of alternative media?
Well, there's no question that Covert Action is a somewhat specialized magazine. We're certainly not a mass readership type magazine. We've never tried to be that degree of popular. We view ourselves as a research tool. We generally publish articles in a relatively scholarly format, lots of footnotes, lots of citations and references, because it's the kind of thing that most of our readers save and use later for reference purposes. And we've tried to avoid too much speculation. Occasionally you have to speculate, like in the AIDS articles, and we say that we're speculating. But we've tried to do investigative reporting of a kind that could be done by mainstream journalists, but with rare exception isn't, simply because their publishers won't run the material. And we're all motivated by a desire to limit what the CIA and related organizations do to try to stop them from conduct we consider is immoral as well as illegal. And there's certainly going to be plenty for us to keep doing. These no matter who becomes president, who gets elected this year, it's not going to change the operations of the secret services very much.
How many subscribers do you have nationally and internationally, and how do you keep the magazine going?
Well, the magazine is pretty much self-sustaining at this point from sales. Once in a while, we will get some contributions from wealthier friends or from a very small foundation. Not too often. Now we've reached a point where subscription sales and newsstand sales pretty much cover the costs of operation. We've been going now for almost 10 years. It'll be our 10th anniversary very soon. And that was not the case in the beginning. And every issue we had to scramble around and try and borrow money from friends or just dig into our own pockets and keep it going. But now we have over 10,000 in circulation, and between 10 and 12,000. Ironically, compared to most magazines, the majority of our circulation is newsstand sales rather than subscribers, which is in fact is unfortunate for us, because newsstand sales, you make much less money as a magazine publisher because you have to give the middleman and the distributor and the news dealer and so on percentages. That it's very unusual. No other magazine we know of our kind has that situation. It's probably because people don't want to be on our mailing list because they're afraid the government can find out who's on your mailing list. And that of course, that's true. I mean, we have to use the post office to mail things out. There's nobody else we can take our mailing business to. And so we've lived with that. And although the subscription list increases very, very slowly, the overall circulation, including newsstand sales, has increased substantially over the years.
Have there been any instances where you have been hassled, or mysterious phone calls, surveillance? Do you have any information on that affecting you or any of your colleagues?
We're virtually certain that the phones are tapped and the offices are bugged, and that's been the case for many, many years. But all of us involved have been political activists for a long time, and we're not unused to that. It's quite common. You get used to assuming that your phone is tapped. It's not a big deal. When we're not involved in planning or committing crimes, so we're not too worried about it anyway. But if we want to talk about a story that's going to appear in the magazine and we don't want people to know about it beforehand, then you don't talk about it on the phone. We've had some weird phone calls, very, very few compared to other organizations, and we've had occasional very strange visitors. More often we get the other way around, which is the extremely friendly people who want to come and help and volunteer and take care of the office and do all sorts of things for us, and are just so eager to volunteer that they've got to be agents. And of course, we're not a membership organization, so these people don't get to join up with us too easily. The only kind of substantive harassment we've had is on occasion shipments of the magazine have been mislaid or misdirected, and things get lost, and very often with a considerable selectiveness. When we ran an issue about the Bulgarian connection, which was very much related to Europe, the whole packet of magazine that went to Europe to be sub-distributed out there disappeared. And we didn't find out about it for a long time, and then we had to resend the whole packages of magazines. And occasionally, specific ones that will be of interest to particular people, journalists, researchers, academics, or whatever, won't arrive. And it can't all be because they've got an angry mailman who sees it and rips it up. So that those things happen, but they're fairly minor inconveniences, and nothing compared to what most political activists are used to. Certainly nothing like what happens to victims of COINTELPRO, what happens to groups like CISPES when the FBI does all that to them.
And you've set up the Institute for Media Analysis, which now also publishes books and sponsors public talks.
Right. This is a totally separate organization with some overlap in people, but not totally so. The Institute for Media Analysis is a New York nonprofit corporation which does essentially educational work, investigating disinformation and propaganda, and publishes scholarly monographs, runs seminars and conferences, and does research services for journalists, for academics, for other researchers. And we've a group of us that have a certain amount of expertise in issues of propaganda and disinformation have got together to do that, and that's works somewhat separately. Again, you run into some of the same people, because a lot of the disinformation and propaganda that we investigate at the Institute are very close to, if not precisely, intelligence operations that we might have been investigating as Covert Action Information Bulletin. So there's a certain amount of overlap there. As I mentioned before, the media and propaganda operations are one of the major facets of CIA work, and hundreds of millions of dollars are spent every year in that kind of work.
We're sitting here in your office in New York, and there are photographs of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Maurice Bishop. Do these men inspire you?
Well, I never knew Che Guevara. I find a lot about his life that I've learned to be somewhat inspirational. Maurice Bishop was a personal friend of my wife's and myself. We knew him before he became Prime Minister of Grenada, and was an extremely inspiring person whom we admired greatly. And I certainly I think that that Fidel Castro is one of the more brilliant world leaders around today, someone who's had to deal with incredible difficulties very successfully over the years. I mean, of course, you didn't mention I've got Paul Robeson on the wall, and I've got Vito Marcantonio, and I've got Sam Nujoma and Sean McBride and Sacco and Vanzetti and Madam Bin and a few other people on the wall. Not too many of whom we knew personally, but yes, I think that there's a certain amount of inspiration to be got from particularly people like the Cubans who have successfully battled the CIA, people like the Vietnamese who have successfully battled the entire massive might of the United States. One of the things we're often asked is isn't it discouraging? Don't you really find it just terribly down to be working against the CIA and such a powerful machinery? And the fact is that they're not all powerful, and over time they keep losing. And third world peoples without any comparable technology do win. So that's inspiring in a sense by itself, regardless of individuals.
Who are some people active in the media writing today that inspire you here in the United States?
Well, I think in the work we do, some of the best stuff has been done by Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman, who are phenomenal researchers of the media and who are able to analyze the way the New York Times will deal with a subject, for example, the way the major networks will cover a topic in a way that very few other people do, partly, I guess, because of their training, or certainly Chomsky's training in semantics and linguistics and so on. But it's very difficult work to expose something where the disinformation is not something simple like flipping a fact and making something white instead of black or yes instead of no, but where the disinformation involves the more subtle means. They're excellent at analyzing that in both international coverage and domestic coverage. In terms of day-to-day journalists in the newspapers, there aren't very many who specialize in this kind of work. Alex Coburn, I think, is one of the other geniuses in this area. He also happens to be a magnificent writer, regardless of the subject, and I find that quite inspiring. But most of the major media can't. They might have people working for them who would uncover these things and write about them if they were allowed to, but normally they don't. When you get somebody like Ray Bonner at the Times, who was writing about what was really happening in El Salvador and how it wasn't being covered that way in this country, he ended up being forced out of his job because he was exposing what was going on. And it's extremely difficult in this country for mainstream journalists, however well-meaning they may be, to really deal with this issue.
Give our listeners a contact address for Covert Action.
Absolutely. Anyone who wants to write us can write to P.O. Box 50272, Washington, D.C. 20004, or they can write to us in New York at 145 West 4th Street, New York, 10012. That's the address of the Institute for Media Analysis. Let me repeat it. New York is 145 West 4th Street, New York 10012, and Washington is Box 50272, Washington, D.C. 20004.
Thank you. My guest has been Bill Schaap, editor of Covert Action and Information Bulletin and director of the Institute for Media Analysis in New York. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.